Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're doing something really fascinating. We are looking way beyond the surface of a simple blanket. For over 200 years, the quilt has been one of the most personal and, honestly, most universal art forms in North America. We usually just think of them as functional bed coverings to keep us warm, right? But today we're going to peel back the layers to see how they actually function as rich historical documents. There's a great saying that quilts contain unspoken stories and histories, and that is exactly what we're doing today. We are going to learn how to literally read these fabric documents, from deep individual grief to shared community values and even massive cultural collisions. It's all woven right in. So let's dive in and see what these makers were actually trying to tell us. Part 1. The personal canvas, stitching joy, sorrow, and conformity. Okay, to really understand the personal motives behind a quilt, let's look at a tale of two very different makers from a quilting beat. First, we have Sarah. She chose a bright mauve to represent the warmth of her family, but she intentionally mixed in a deep, dark country blue. Why? To represent the dreary, lonely winter days she experienced after her husband died. Her quilt was designed to mirror her very specific, emotional life journey. But then, we have Elizabeth. Her motive was completely different. She went with a traditional log cabin design strictly because, well, it was what her mother and grandmother made. She even carefully calculated her fabric to cost exactly $65.74 on sale. These contrasting stories perfectly show how hidden motives, whether that's deep emotional processing or just a desire for community conformity and thrift, completely shape the final fabric. Part 2. The language of patterns, decoding community identity. Now, let's zoom out a bit. Amish and Mennonite groups use pure geometry as a kind of secret language to communicate their deep, shared values. Take the log cabin pattern, for example. It uses a red center square to symbolize the hearth of the home. Then you've got the sunshine and shadow pattern, which uses alternating light and dark squares. That represents the balance of joy and sorrow we all inevitably face in life. And the double wedding ring? Its interlocking circles symbolize enduring love and marriage. They aren't just making pretty designs. They are literally stitching their entire worldview into the geometry. And speaking of that log cabin pattern, it has actually been an absolute American classic since the Civil War era. Notice how the thin strips of fabric are pieced together to build around that center square? It actually mimics the physical walls of a log cabin surrounding a central chimney. Like we mentioned, that center is usually red to signify the warm hearth, but sometimes it's yellow to represent a welcoming light in the window. It is just a timeless, beautiful tribute to the family home. Now contrast that warmth with an incredibly striking design, like the Amish-centered diamond pattern, a classic from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. What's so fascinating here is that the Amish originally rejected decorative quilting. They saw it as way too extravagant for their plain lifestyle, but when they finally did adopt it, they stuck to deep, solid-color wools and incredibly strict geometry. So why this specific design? Well, a large diamond enclosed in a square perfectly reflects the agricultural layout of their surrounding crop fields. It is a brilliant, literal reflection of their commitment to a plain, earthbound way of life. Part 3. Cultural Crossroads, when traditions blend. This stunning 8-pointed star is known as a Bethlehem star quilt, but the specific one was made by a Native American Odawa maker in late 19th century Michigan. You see, Native Americans learned European sewing and patchwork techniques from Christian missionaries, but they didn't just copy those European designs. No, they adapted them to honor their own rich traditions, creating an entirely new cultural crossroads in fabric. For this Native American maker, the radiating star design holds profound spiritual significance. Visually, it echoes the circles of eagle feather bonnets. It also represents the rays of the sun and the morning star, which are symbols traditionally painted on buffalo robes. Even the 8 points hold a specific meaning. They symbolize each member of a family. And that center point? That represents the Great Spirit binding them all together. It's so powerful. They took a standard European technique and stitched their own profound spiritual worldview right into the geometry. Meanwhile, if we shift our focus over to 1840s Baltimore, we see a totally different cultural shift happening. Baltimore was a wealthy, prosperous seaport at the time, and the wives of the growing merchant class started creating these incredibly elaborate album quilts. This particular one from 1846 honors a fallen Mexican war hero, Major Ringgold. Now, instead of using old fabric scraps, these were made with newly purchased expensive fabrics. They acted as highly detailed, luxurious fabric scrapbooks meant to commemorate weddings, community presentations, or, in this case, political heroes.
Part 4. From Heirlooms to Art, the Great American Quilt Revival.
To really understand how quilts evolved in the public eye, we have to compare these two concepts. On one hand, you have a Victorian crazy quilt from the late 1800s. It's wild, chaotic, totally asymmetrical, and made of expensive silks and velvets, strictly to show off wealth and artistic expression in the parlor room. On the other hand, look at the Amish center diamond again. It's spare, structured, minimalist, and above all, practical. It's amazing to think that these two vastly contrasting cultural values existed at the exact same time in American history. So, how did the outside world start viewing these purely functional items as actual art? Well, a massive culture shock happened in 1971. That's when the Whitney Museum in New York hosted an exhibition that took quilts off the bed and displayed them on the wall, exactly like abstract paintings. The perception shifted overnight. Suddenly, Amish heirlooms went from being kept folded up in dark wooden chests to being highly sought-after cult objects. By the 1980s, corporate brands like Esprit were actually hanging Amish quilts in their headquarters and using them as literal mood boards to design fashion vests. The visual aesthetic impact suddenly took complete precedence over their original functional use. And that dramatic shift leads us directly to contemporary art quilts, like this one titled Peace and Quiet by Cynthia England from 1993. At first glance, you'd probably swear this looks exactly like a painting, right? But the artist created this highly realistic landscape scene purely from carefully cut fabric and thread. She completely abandoned traditional paint. It totally challenges everything we think a quilt is supposed to look like. And today? Well, today's contemporary artists are shattering that definition even further. The modern art quilt doesn't even have to be made of standard layered fabric anymore. Artists are constantly pushing the physical boundaries. They are weaving in discarded clothing, salvaged electronic parts, obsolete computer chips, and even things like wire mesh and wood. They use these unconventional materials to tell incredibly personal stories and explore completely new concepts. The possibilities are truly endless.
So we've traveled from personal grief stitched into humble fabric to secret community decoder rings, all the way to high-end contemporary art made of computer chips. It really makes you look at the everyday items around you a bit differently, doesn't it? I want to leave you with this final thought. What hidden stories will the everyday objects in your home tell future historians about who you were and what your community valued? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, always keep looking beyond the surface.